My 8-year-old granddaughter leaned over the armchair, eyes wide, and in a voice so small it sounded like a secret, she said, "They're going to put you in a home and take your money." I remember the sound of the words more than anything else. Thin, fragile, impossible for a child to carry, and heavy enough to sink a boat. For a beat, I laughed, because what else do you do when the world tilts? Then my laugh dried up. I looked at Emma and saw the seriousness in the way she chewed her lower lip. She didn't know how to be dramatic. She just knew the shape of things she'd overheard. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I like to know who I'm talking to. City, small town, nursing home room number, it all matters. But stay with me. This whisper, that day, changed everything. It wasn't always that way. There was a time when our house smelled of coffee and sawdust, when Frank was humming over the newspaper and the porch light never blinked out. Frank died on a Tuesday, slow and definite, 18 months before Emma's whisper. He had been the kind of man who kept receipts in alphabetical order and held my hand in the theater when the credits rolled. When he was gone, the silence took up space in the rooms. His slippers, the soft dent in the couch, the chicken pot roast that never quite turned out the same without him. Brian, our son, came around a lot at first. He cried like his heart might split. Jessica baked casseroles. They said all the right things. They said, "Ma, let us help. You can't be alone in that house." And I let them help, because what else are you supposed to do when your child offers you a ladder to climb down from grief? I wanted warmth, not strategies. There are 100 small ways a life can change so gradually you only notice when you trace your path back. A friend stopped calling. The Sunday bridge game dwindled to a line on the calendar that never filled. The mailbox grew heavier with bills I didn't understand. Brian moved in, claiming he would manage things until I felt steady again. Jessica said she could keep the house tidy. At first, it was a kindness. Later, it looked a lot like taking over. It started with helpful suggestions. Maybe sell the house, they said. Large houses are a burden at your age. Downsizing could be easier. Frank had loved the house, but it was just a thing. The thought of stairs made me tired. I signed papers that blurred details into trust. Not maliciously, mind you. I was tired. I trusted them. I did not imagine betrayal. Then the little things accumulated like unpaid grocery tabs. Brian started telling me, casually, that Social Security would barely cover utilities, that we'll supplement things if I sold the house. Jessica would remind me of the paperwork I forgot to file, the forms I was too tired to read. They climbed into my calendar and rearranged my life under the guise of concern. There were guilt lines, too. "If you don't sell, we'll lose the chance to build a safer future," Brian would say. Or else, "Frank would want what's best for you." They made me feel disloyal if I questioned them, and loyalty is a muscle that atrophies when used wrong. Once, when I hesitated, Brian put his hand on my shoulder and told me he had quit his job to look after me. It was a line that pinned me. How do you argue with a son who says he gave up his paycheck for your comfort? I remember the day we sold the house like a bright bruise. The buyers loved the maple tree in front, declared the kitchen charming, and handed over the checks. The house, with its chipped fence and Frank's toolbox in the garage, went to strangers. Brian and Jessica moved most of their things into my new, smaller place under the pretext of helping with the move. At night, they ate at my table, their phones face up and their eyes half on me, half on something else. Emma's crayons made little suns on my kitchen table. She tucked them into my pockets before she left, and each time I found a waxy sun, a small warmth followed. There were signs I should have seen sooner. Mail that used to arrive thick with magazines and friends cards came scant. My bank statements grew sparse in the parts I expected fat balances. A doctor's appointment I had kept for years got rescheduled because someone had made a note that I was forcibly unwell. When I asked for the note, they smiled and said, "You don't need to worry about that, Ma." The manipulation was slow and polite, like ivy spreading over brick. Isolation was the first tactic. Friends stopped visiting. Newcomers at church were greeted by Brian and Jessica, and I gradually became the woman who was cared for rather than the neighbor who brought pie. My phone rang less. When it did, their names came up more often. It wasn't angry theft, not at first. It was methodical, disguised as caregiving. Emma, being 8, noticed the things adults missed. She has a bluntness that is both embarrassing and necessary. One afternoon, she sat next to me on the couch, swinging her legs, and hummed while she colored. From the way she stared at the TV when Brian came home and dropped his coffee cup on the rug, I could tell she'd been listening. Children listen differently. Later, because children can't keep a thing to themselves in the way adults do, she slipped. "They said we should move, Grandma," she told her mother one night, as if they were chatting about a school play. "They said she'll be better off in a home. Mom said we have to do what's best." Jessica's voice was low, hushed like a stage whisper, and Brian's laugh, that polite, too loud laugh, threaded under the conversation. Emma overheard the tense syllables and didn't understand the calculations behind them. She just recognized that the word home was a threat and money was a thing they were whispering about. I don't remember plotting from the first syllable. There are people who leap into heroic action. I am mostly the woman who prefers to think. But Emma's whisper went through me like wind through chimes. It made something vibrate. The realization that your fate might be decided by people you love is an inside-out kind of cold. I felt exposed. I called David Morrison. He was an old friend, the kind of lawyer who had once argued over backyard fences with Frank and brought lemon bars to neighborhood barbecues. We had sat on the same bench at church for years. I didn't call to make a spectacle. I called because I needed someone who would listen, who would not put their hand over my mouth. David answered on the second ring. He asked me 2 questions, calm, surgical. "Are you safe? Are you of sound mind?" I laughed because the first seemed absurd, and I told him about Emma. He came that afternoon in an old suit with cuffs just shy of the elbow, smelling faintly of cedar. We sat at my little kitchen table while the kettle hissed in the background. David listened, then folded his hands like a man studying a chessboard. "We'll move quickly," he said, but quietly. That phrase, quietly, felt like armor. We could not, I learned, call the whole neighborhood to arms. There were steps that had to be kept small and tight, otherwise they would hear. Janet at First National Bank was, in her own way, an accomplice of decency. She had been the manager on our street branch for as long as I had been a customer. She used to remember my birthday. When I called her, I asked for an emergency meeting, and she said, "Come in, Margaret. Bring Emma if you like." I brought Emma because the child could unwittingly do what adults could not. She could distract with truth. Emma sat in the corner of the bank with a lollipop she had negotiated from Jessica, sucking it slowly, as if she had been deputized into secrecy. The manager ushered us into a small room with a clock, a plant, and a thickness of privacy. David introduced himself, papers shuffled like small flags. "We need to revoke any powers of attorney that were active," he said. "We need to move some assets, we need to set up a new will, and we need to do all of this before any interference can be legally made." I have never liked the phrase, "I need to do." It sounds like a demand. The phrase is correct here, though. I remember Janet's hands steady on a pin, the way she looked at Emma as if the child were a weather vane telling her the wind direction. We made a plan. We closed accounts that were accessible and opened ones that were not. We created a new trust arrangement. The numbers were precise. $637,412. That is a sum that looked like safety on paper and looked like treasure to others. It was not all of my finances, but it was the liquid part of my life, the cushion Frank and I had tucked away over decades of small sacrifices. We made a plan. We closed accounts that were accessible and opened ones that were not. We created a new trust arrangement. The numbers were precise: $637,412. That is a sum that looked like safety on paper and looked like treasure to others. It was not all of my finances, but it was the liquid part of my life, the cushion Frank and I had tucked away over decades of small sacrifices. The bank manager moved with the kind of discreet diligence I imagined lawyers in old films must have displayed. Signatures, stamps, the kind of authority people hand to each other in rooms with blinds. I did not smuggle cash under my mattress or characteristically dramatic things like that. Instead, David and I orchestrated a transfer timed to close before Brian and Jessica returned from errands, before their hands could move where they had put them. It felt like racing a clock that nobody else could see. I had my phone on vibrate, and each notification felt like a footstep. The transfer went through with a soft chime on Janet's monitor. I saw the digits, that neat line of numbers rearrange into the new account, and a small, exquisite relief tightened across my chest. We also revoked the power of attorney Brian had assumed. It had taken him months of nudges, of casual help with forms, of being present at doctors' offices to create a narrative that he was the responsible adult, as if responsibility wore a name tag. When David handed Brian the revocation paperwork later that evening, I watched Brian's face change like weather. He smiled at first, a tight, practiced smile that had come to serve him in troubled times. Then the tilt of his jaw hardened. Before all this, I should say, I learned to keep hard copies. Receipts, emails, grocery lists, mundane things that most people toss without a second thought, became evidence. I had a stack of grocery receipts that at first seemed like the detritus of ordinary life. Later, they were little breadcrumbs showing the kind of unpaid labor I had been doing: cooking for 4 adults, buying supplies for the household, patching things up with my own hands. The receipts showed purchases in my name for things Brian and Jessica used. They were the ledger of the life they had quietly decided I should fund. I planned a dinner. It would be, on the surface, ordinary: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the kind of comfort food that makes people unguarded. I wanted them to arrive thinking they were stepping into family normalcy. I wanted David and Janet close enough that the reveal could land like a tarp over whatever had been hidden. I set the table with my good plates. Emma insisted on placing her crayon suns on each napkin. She helped carry the casserole dish in, humming a tune that made me want to cry. The plan felt theatrical. I suppose it was. There is a kind of justice in a small staged unmasking. I had rehearsed nothing. I wanted my fury to be clean. Brian arrived with the smell of cologne and the nervous manner of someone who is not used to being in the wrong. Jessica was bright and insistent. They sat like guests in their own house. I let them get comfortable. Conversation at the table drifted to weather and the neighbor's new fence. Then I stood. "We need to talk," I said, the words like butter on toast, ordinary until they aren't. David cleared his throat. She reached over and took my hand, the small fingers strong in their own way. The contact steadied me. I knew facts: the life insurance a friend had once mentioned, an oddity in a beneficiary form, a second policy that did not match the story told to the family. I had heard rumors. Older people always do. I had banknotes that suggested transfers, and there were emails later that showed administrative toggles that made me suspicious. But the suggestion of missing insurance money was a new kind of poison. It implied collusion beyond simple care. When you stand in a room where your loyalty and your ledger have become indistinguishable, you are forced to pick a side. I chose myself. I had, to that point, been doing what many of us do when we are politely edged out, hoping for the best while making small private corrections. I had moved the money, revoked the POA, set up the will. But now there was the suggestion of something bigger, an implication that my husband's name had been used as a leathery mask for greed. No one stood and announced guilt. In our culture, accusatory declarations belong to courtroom dramas and the sort of television that makes a case of everything. Instead, there were looks, small animals of expression, a lip pressed, a hand covering a smile, a throat clearing. After the dinner, the house felt aerated in a way I had not known was possible. It felt lighter and raw. I had expected recrimination. I had expected tantrums and maybe a television interview I could not stomach. What I did not expect was the neat, cold slide of someone saying, almost as an aside, there may be other money missing. That night, I didn't sleep. The house I had loved and lost once felt like a place of interrogation. I sat at the edge of the bed and held on to what was mine. Emma slept in the next room, the small rise and fall of her breathing like a metronome. My mind pulled threads of the past like a seamstress untangling a hem. Receipts, emails, the signature on a life insurance form, little stitches that might conceal a gash. I had taken decisive steps, but the suggestion of missing funds introduced a new algebra of betrayal. It was one thing to be edged out of a kitchen. It was another to find that the bedrock had been hollowed. I kept thinking of Frank's hands, the way he had once fixed the fence, the way he would check the car's oil on Sunday mornings, and I felt the injustice of someone folding his life into a ledger. So I called Linda. That is, I called the woman whose name had surfaced in a paper I had not seen in full until later, a woman who had been Frank's secretary, and, according to things that made my stomach turn, more. I told myself I was calling as a courtesy, as a fact finder, but the truth is, I called because names need voices, and voices do things. I needed to hear. Her voice on the phone was careful, pleasantly surprised, as if she had been expecting a call from a subscriber list and had accidentally received a family member instead. "Margaret," she said, and there was a layer of recognition that unsettled me, as though our mutual past had been known to her in different clothes. We arranged to meet for lunch at a small diner, the kind with polished chrome and coffee cups that never went empty. I do not like confrontations in public, but there is, in public, a safety. Linda was later to be more than a name on a form. She was, at that table, a human being with reasons, and her eyebrows were capable of narrative. She looked at me with an expression like someone who had stepped into a room with instructions to be polite. "Margaret," she said, and there was the sound of someone threading an apology into a sentence. "I didn't realize you knew." "Know what?" I asked, because I wanted the straight line drawn. It is easier to tackle an accusation when you have the geometry of it. She started, quietly. "There was a policy. It was," she hesitated, "it named me at one point. I thought it had been handled. I didn't know anything about money moving." Sometimes people tell the truth because it is the only refuge left. Sometimes they tell parts. Linda's eyes dodged like a fish. She was nervous in the way of someone asked to read their own love letters at gunpoint. In that booth at the diner, beneath the low hum of the television, the first piece of the twist took shape. I left with more questions than answers. When I walked back to the car, the light felt colder. I did not yet have the proof. I had suspicions and a phone number and a small, uneasy alignment. But the arc of the story had changed. I had gone from defending my home to standing in a room where the very terms of my husband's estate were in question. There is a peculiar mercy in action. It sharpens the mind. I had agency again. I had David. I had Emma's tiny fist in mine, steady and full of trust. I had receipts tucked in a shoebox and a bank manager who remembered my name. I had little tools, not dramatic weapons, but even small tools can break a lock if you keep at it long enough. The night after the diner, I sat with a pad and a pen and wrote down everything I could think of. Bank movements, conversations, odd phrases, dates. There was a system in the mess. I started to feel a quiet, ferocious clarity, the kind that comes when the bones knew what the heart didn't. And so, with the house quieter and the world more awake, I prepared. I had moved money. I had revoked a power. I had changed a will. I had told my family I would not be moved without my say. But the hint, the suggestion that someone had taken more than they were owed, that Frank's name had been used as a pass for greed, hung in the air like a sentence unfinished. It made me cautious. It made me determined. It made me ready for the next step, which would be to follow the trail of numbers and to call, with all the quiet force I possessed, for the truth. If this is striking a chord with you, or you know someone who ought to hear this, share where you're watching from in the comments. Maybe your story will help someone listen faster than I did. Maybe your story will help someone listen faster than I did. After I dropped that plea into the internet, the next weeks felt like walking through a house of mirrors. Every reflection showed a different angle of the same thing. What had been close to me had been used as cover. I kept moving forward because there was no other sensible option. David and I made lists. Janet pulled ledgers from drawers and searched for threads only a bank employee who'd watched a family for decades could find. Emma came with me to a few meetings. She learned, in blunt child ways, that adults sometimes spoke in secrets and that truth sometimes needed a grown-up to fetch it. We began where a paper trail exists, the bank records. Janet and her team quietly pulled copies of transfers and flagged anything unusual. There were payments that, on the surface, were labeled mundane, household maintenance or funeral arrangements. But when you looked closely, the amounts and the destination accounts didn't match what a grieving family normally spends. Some checks cleared to vendors we didn't recognize. Some wire transfers were routed through accounts with names that didn't look like ours. It felt like peeling an orange that someone else had been eating for months. The $637,412 I had moved into a protected account was only part of what the records showed. There were transfers that I had not authorized. Some funds from life insurance payouts that were supposed to come to the estate had, according to a pattern of banknotes, been diverted. There was a wire to an out-of-state account that matched exactly the day and nearly the amount. My hands had been empty and grieving. The numbers were cold and exact. Numbers don't shout, they testify. I won't pretend this was easy. Banking investigations move with the slowness of committees and the urgency of rattling people's reputations. But once Janet decided to help, she moved like a person who had been waiting for permission. She placed internal flags. She made calls that said, "We need this treated as possible elder financial exploitation." That phrase is clinical but useful. It provided a pathway for others to pay attention. With Janet's reports in hand, David made the call to the district attorney's office. I remember the day the prosecutor agreed to meet us. The room smelled of lemon cleaner, and the air had that official impartiality that makes people speak plainly. He looked at Janet's printouts and at David's clipped notes, and then at me. "If we file," he said, "we have to be certain. This will be more than family drama." He also said, kindly but firmly, "We need complete documentation, bank records, emails, receipts, anything that shows intent." So we collected everything. Receipts from grocery runs that showed my name buying food for more people than should have been eating in my apartment. Emails from Brian to various account administrators mislabeling things, an odd letter from an insurance company referencing a beneficiary change that didn't match the paperwork in the estate binder. There were petty things: an auto repair receipt paid by me for a car Brian drove, a subscription in my name that serviced him. And there were bigger things, like a transfer out of an insurance account for $500,000 that had passed through an intermediary and ended up in an account under a name I barely recognized. I kept thinking of Frank, the way he would carefully cross his T's. He'd carried the couple of ledgers we had, the little notebooks where we tracked vacation funds and Christmas gifts. I imagined his hands turning pages and saying, "Now, where did that go?" It made me angrier than I expected. Anger is a fine tool when it's directed. It has an accuracy to it. We found the missing policy. It was not part of my original estate files. It turned up in a stack of administrative capers someone at the insurance company dug out when David sent a formal request. The beneficiary line had been changed, and the name that appeared there was Linda's. Not in any bombastic, blood-red type of proof, but the name was there, clean and official on a form. The sums involved and the timing lined up with transfers we had already spotted. There was a moment, late at night, when I sat at my kitchen table with a pile of copies and a mug gone cold, and I realized I was looking at the pattern of an ordinary human mind that had been given rope and ran. The rope had been my trust. We needed Linda to talk. The first time I went to that diner to speak to her, I had thought perhaps she wouldn't help. People in messy situations often protect themselves, and sometimes people keep secrets because their lives would unravel if they didn't. But Linda surprised me. She didn't deny everything outright. That did not mean she admitted everything either. She said things that were slippery, confessions wrapped in caveats, a technique for buying time. "It was a policy," she said quietly, "but I thought it had been settled. I thought—" She searched for a word and found none. "I didn't know about transfers." She blinked like someone who'd been asked to read a sentence in a language she was pretending to understand. David had a knack for asking the right, quiet questions. He didn't accuse. He placed facts like small stones in a line until a path formed. Linda's answers had gaps. There were contradictions between how she described an event and the wire records. When David phrased the timing of an alleged transfer, she couldn't match dates without hesitation. She said her name had been on some paperwork, but insisted she thought it was administrative. She kept annotating with, "I thought," in a way that suggested confusion or culpability, or perhaps both. She agreed to meet a second time with more documentation. She showed up with a folded envelope, and for a moment I thought it would be nothing. Then she opened it, and there it was, a photocopy of a check with a signature similar to Brian's handwriting, an email thread where account details were passed around, and a bank notice with an account number that, when Janet cross-checked it, had received a wire that matched the $500,000 figure. Linda's color shifted. She looked at us like a person caught between being saved and being exposed. "You didn't know how it moved," David said gently. "You were listed as a beneficiary, and then an account took funds that should have been processed another way. We need your full recollection." She admitted, haltingly, that she had received funds and that she had been told the transfer was legitimate. She said she did not know every detail and that she had been told, by a man not named, that arrangements had been made to handle the matter discreetly. Her voice convulsed at the sentence. She seemed to want to be absolved while also wanting to be honest. It was the human equivalent of splitting the difference. It was not my job to be judge and jury. That is not a responsibility I wanted. I wanted truth. Linda's cooperation was, in the end, what provided a bridge between bank records and motive. She agreed to give a sworn statement, one that she later recorded with the state's attorney, saying she had received funds and that Brian had orchestrated the transfers. She said, in tones that didn't entirely match what we all felt, that she had been told it was company handling and that she had not questioned it. When Linda corroborated the transfer trail, the prosecutor arranged that morning when they would act. Arrests are not theatrical moments in small-town life. They are ordinary actions that suddenly have fireworks attached. Brian was arrested. I won't recount the details of the arrest, the precinct, the faces, the photocopied forms. The fact is, one morning he was not on our porch anymore. There was an intake and a mugshot and a long period of processing that reminds you how bureaucratic the consequences of a family's bad choices can be. Charges were filed, elder financial exploitation and fraud, among others that the prosecutor felt were appropriate. The news circulated in the way it does in small towns, slow at first, then suddenly everyone knew. People I hadn't seen in months called. Some sent small notes of apology written as if they had been late to notice the obvious. Others were silent. I do not take joy in someone else's unraveling. The day after the arrest, I walked by the vacant room where Brian had slept and found myself hitting small wooden ghosts, the mug he left on the counter, his shoes lined by the door. They became relics of an ordinary life now severed. Jessica, whose name had been threaded through much of the planning, found herself in a quiet center of the storm. She called me once, voice like a rope. "Mom," she said. And then the line broke into something like mourning. She had to find work to reconfigure the life she'd built around the role they'd adopted. I watched her scramble through choices like someone trying to put a tent back together after a wind. The criminal case moved forward. I went to a few hearings because, in cases like this, being present matters. I did not go for vengeance. I went because the fact of my life had been exploited, and I wanted to see that truth acknowledged in an official way. The prosecutor negotiated with Brian's attorney, the professionals doing their ledger work. He pled guilty. He accepted responsibility in the courtroom in a way that was not cinematic but was legally final. A plea, an admission, a binding consequence. The judge ordered restitution. The figure we were told eventually, after negotiations and calculations of transfers and consults, was $700,000. It was an amount that tried to stitch together measurable financial harm, replacing what had been taken and accounting for fees, penalties, and the unraveling. Brian would be required to pay restitution and serve time followed by probation. The sentence had the formality of a legal machine doing what a community asks of it. To some, it felt like closure. To others, it felt like a cost accounting. For me, it felt like justice in the sense that it was recognized. Recognition matters. The restitution did not instantly refill every corner of the life that had been bled dry. Money returned cannot fully recover trust or the small stolen years. But it allowed me to stabilize. It let me move into a small, bright apartment on the second floor of a building with a community garden in the back and a mail carrier who knew my name. I bought a chair that fit my spine properly. I paid off a few debts that had been creeping because Brian had managed them. Financial safety suddenly settled like a soft blanket. Jessica's life did change. She lost a job opportunity when her employer, upon hearing the headlines, decided it was a risk. She had to move out of our place. The legal consequences for her were different. The prosecutor concentrated on the primary orchestrator. She had to rebuild. In the quiet moments after everything changed, she would come by with Emma on the weekends at first, and then less often, until we defined what a safe contact looked like. I forgave, but I also required boundaries. Forgiveness without boundary is merely permission. Emma watched all of this with the incomprehension and profound clarity of a child. She did not understand restitution or indictment, but she knew who loved her and who kept her safe. When Brian was arrested, she asked me simply, "Will he get better?" I did not have the kind of answer that fixes the world. I told her the truth in the way adults should speak to children. He will get help, and he will have to answer for what he did. People can change, but we have to be careful and we have to protect you. Her days became our anchor. We established a predictable rhythm. Weekends with Emma were sacred. We went to the park and baked cookies and worked on a little herb garden in a window box. She learned to make a simple omelet, to tie her shoes, to say please and thank you in a way that was more than habit. It was basic dignity. She drew pictures of the two of us holding hands, and I pinned them above my kitchen sink like little flags that declared, "We are here." I also did things for myself. I enrolled in a class at the community college, creative writing of all things. I wanted to find words again. Frank used to laugh at my habit of rearranging the furniture when the seasons changed. This felt like rearranging the furniture of my mind. The class was full of people my age and younger, each with different reasons for sitting in the same room with a notebook. I learned that late-life reinvention is less about big gestures and more about steady attendance to small talents. It felt oddly gratifying to hand in an essay and receive a red line that improved me. Volunteering followed as naturally as kettle after tea. I started helping at a center that assists seniors with bills, an irony that pleased me. The work felt like the kind of balancing the world needs. Those who had been taken care of now helping others avoid the same holes. I led a small workshop, Keep Your Papers I called it, about the virtues of keeping receipts, making copies, and having someone outside the family who knows where your documents live. I said repeatedly and always gently that I was not giving legal advice. I was telling a story. People nodded and then stayed for the cookies. There were difficult conversations. I took a call from Brian one afternoon, months into his sentence. He'd been released on probation for a period and had sent a letter asking to speak. The sound of his voice at the other end of the line was smaller than I expected. He asked for forgiveness. He said there had been moments in jail that made him understand the harm he had done. He spoke with a kind of worn clarity. I listened. It would have been easier to make a ceremonial speech on the rightness of punishment, to deliver a line of moral triumph. But life is messier, and mercy sometimes looks like a measured, conditional reach. I forgive you, I said, but I have to be careful. Forgiveness doesn't erase what you did. I told him about the restitution and the conditions of his probation. I told him that visits would have to be supervised, and that, for now, contact would come through mediated means. He wept, a small human sound. Whether he would keep to the promises he made, I could not know. The law had given me some safety, and my own boundaries would provide the rest. The community around me surprised me in the gentlest ways. Neighbors brought over casseroles. Old friends called and shared small, ordinary memories of Frank. A woman from my church drove me to a hearing when Emma had a play that afternoon. The public attention that followed the arrest dwindled into everyday concern. People stopped wanting to gossip and more often wanted to help stack the chairs after the bake sale. There is grace in public forgetting if it is followed by private care. Part of the healing was relearning daily autonomy. I took the bus into town sometimes instead of relying on others. I set appointments and went alone. There was a pleasure in the small self-directed things, buying a plant whose leaves unfurled like a slow smile, arranging my shelves so that the books Frank used to love sat beside my notebook. I kept a manila folder labeled hard copy, stuffed with the receipts, emails, and statements that had once served as my defense. It sat in a drawer, and sometimes I take it out like a rosary and remind myself what had been done and what I had saved. I also learned the delicate art of forgiving with boundaries. Forgiveness felt like letting go of the corrosive urgency to punish, but boundaries meant not pretending the harm had never happened. I saw Brian twice after his release, once in the presence of a mediator, once across a hospital waiting room where we sat at opposite ends of the bench and spoke in careful phrases. Jessica came to see Emma on occasion. We kept the visit supervised and within my comfort. The edges of our relationship were new shapes, gentle, protected, sometimes sorrowful. The most private triumph was the way my relationship with Emma matured. She moved from being the child who overheard a plot to the companion who learned to be a kind of sentry for our small household. She would tuck a note under my door in the morning. "Have a good day, Grandma." She learned how to check the mail and would show me the envelopes as if she were inspecting treasure. She became my reason to keep learning. We signed up for a pottery class together and laughed when our vases came home lopsided and proud. When people ask what it felt like to forgive, I answer with the practicalities. Forgiveness is a decision to stop letting the action define you daily, but it is not an erasure. I forgave in the sense that I no longer wanted to carry the injury around like an ornament. I also enforced consequences because love without boundaries risks reharm. There is a distinction between unconditional forgiveness and unguarded trust. If I had learned anything, it was that the two are not the same. Over time, the court's restitution process began to feed back. It was never an instant infusion that fixed everything, but it was a progressive return of what had been taken and an acknowledgement by the system that harm had occurred. The money helped me secure the apartment, and it paid for some counseling sessions that I had initially resisted because one muddles feelings, one should be practical. The counseling helped me recognize that what had happened to me was not a moral failing, but a criminal act dressed up as familial concern. The community college certificate I earned in that creative writing class became more significant than any credential. It was the proof of a mind that still craves and can still engage. I started a small blog, nothing flashy or monetized, just a place where I wrote about the smell of rain on the porch and what it felt like to make a stew that fed 2 rather than 6. People began to write back, telling me their stories. A neighbor's father whose car title was mysteriously transferred. A woman's aunt who'd been moved to a facility for reasons that didn't add up. The letters came with gratitude and questions. Each one reminded me why I had to stand up. We ended the year with a small celebration. Emma and I, a baked salmon, and a slice of cake that tasted like the way snow melts, quietly and without spectacle. We sat at my small table and read a card someone sent from a church group. Your courage helped someone else, it said. That sums it up. Courage often looks like doing the thing you dread, sorting papers, making calls, sitting in hearings while everyone else looks away. I won't romanticize the end. People in our family still speak in halting sentences. There are relationships that will never return to their previous intimacy, and that is a reality I accept. Forgiveness and salvage do not mean forgetting. They mean constructing a life that can hold both memory and safety. I am kinder and greedier for small joys. I have a better bent for who I share my keys with, who I let into my pantry of trust. In hindsight, the smallest of voices, the one that belonged to an 8-year-old, did the greatest heavy lifting. Emma taught me that truth often arrives with no ceremony, and that children, in their bluntness, can be mortal compasses. Listen to the child with the lollipop. They sometimes have the only map you need. If you take anything from this, let it be simple. Keep your documents, keep a friend who is not part of a tense family relationship. And if something doesn't feel right, gather facts quietly. I say this as a story of what helped me, not as instruction. I had a lawyer, a bank manager's diligence, and a community that made space. Each person's circumstances differ. Life today is softer. I have a new apartment that smells faintly of basil and lemon. I take the bus to my class and come home to Emma's drawings taped around my mirror. I volunteer twice a month and tend to my window box that now holds parsley, thyme, and a brave, crooked basil plant. I have friends who bring casseroles and a daughter-in-law who passes by sometimes with an awkward apology and an offer to help. I accept some things and decline others. The title of this video names a truth. Grandma's fortune in Jeopardy, the truth my granddaughter uncovered. It was, in every sense, the truth that changed the shape of our family. Emma's whisper, small, precise, and devastating, altered the course of a quiet autumn and set in motion a recovery that required legal muscles, human compassion, and my own slow reassembly. If this moved you, share your story in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Maybe, just maybe, your voice will help someone notice the whisper before it becomes a shout.